This series of 8 videos is taken from my full course Vue JS 3 Composition API with Pinia and Vite. If you're already familiar with Vue 2 and the Options API, then this course will teach you everything you need to know to get started with Vue 3 and the Composition API. Please note that we won't be covering Pinia here on YouTube, but we will be covering refs, reactive objects, methods, computed properties, watchers, lifecycle hooks, directives, Vue router, template refs, teleport, child components including props, emits and model value, and much more. This is the first video of 8 where I'll introduce the course, explain what the Composition API is, and show you the core differences between the Options API and the Composition API. You can find a link to the whole playlist and a link to the full course down in the description. Hi there, my name's Danny Connell and welcome to this course, Vue JS 3 Composition API with Pinia and Vite. If you're already familiar with Vue 2 and the Options API, then this course will teach you everything you need to know to switch over to and get started with Vue 3 and the Composition API. Here's roughly what we're going to do in this course. In Module 1, I'm going to introduce you to the course, explain what the Composition API is, show you my editor setup, which is VS Code, including installing all of the extensions that I'm going to be using, and we're going to install Vue DevTools to help us with our development. In Module 2, I'm going to introduce you to the Vue 3 documentation site. We're going to install Node.js so that we can get started creating Vue 3 apps. And we're going to create a Vue project using the latest build tool with Vite. Then we're going to get that project ready for us to start learning the basics. In Module 3, we're going to look at the key differences between the Options API and the Composition API. We're going to create a very simple Options API app to remind us how the Options API worked. Then we're going to convert that simple Options API app to use the Composition API instead. This will give us a really quick and simple way to see the key differences between the two approaches. Then we're going to look at the differences between the two different patterns we can use with the Composition API, which is the older setup function pattern and the newer and superior script setup pattern. In Module 4, we're going to learn all about data. We're going to learn about reactive data, including refs and reactive objects. We're going to learn about two-way binding, and we're going to look at non-reactive data. Module 5 is all about methods. We're going to learn about methods, computed properties, and watchers. In Module 6, we're going to learn all about how we use lifecycle hooks differently in the Composition API, including mounted hooks, activated hooks, updated hooks, and how we can use multiple hooks of the same type within a single component. In Module 7, we're going to learn all about directives in the Composition API. We're going to learn how to create local custom directives, which are local to an individual component. Then we're going to look at how we can create global custom directives, which can be used by any of the components in our app. In Module 8, we're going to learn all about how we use Vue router differently in the Composition API, including how we can use the $root object to display information from our router in our template, and the brand new useRoute and useRouter composables. In Module 9, we're going to learn about lists using V4, the amazing new teleport component. We're going to learn how to use template refs so that we can access elements which are in our component and then do something with that element when our component has loaded, such as focusing an input. We're also going to learn how to use nextTick using the Composition API. In Module 10, we're going to learn all about child components, including how we can pass content to a child component using slots, how we can pass data to child components using props, how we can emit a custom event from a child component to a parent component using emits, how we can get a child component to modify a data property on its parent component using model value and update model value. We're going to look at dynamic components, which allow us to switch out the component which is being used in a particular part of our app. And we're going to look at how we can provide data from a parent component to all of its descendant components using provide inject. In Module 11, we're going to learn all about composables, which is one of the most exciting new features with Vue 3. We're going to first answer the question, what is a composable? Then we're going to create a custom composable, which will allow us to share reactive data and related methods across our components. Then we're going to install and set up a composable from the Vue use library as well. In Module 12, we're going to learn all about state management using Pinia, which is currently the gold standard for state management in Vue 3 Composition API apps. We're going to first answer the question, what is state management? We're going to look at 3 different approaches to state management in a Vue 3 app using either composables, Vuex, or Pinia. And we're going to look at the differences between these. Then we're going to learn all about state with Pinia, and state is where we store all of our data properties in a Pinia store. Then we're going to learn all about actions with Pinia, and actions are methods which are in our store which allow us to modify the data that's in our state. And then we're going to learn about getters, which allow us to get some data from our state, modify it in some way, and then make that data available to all of our components. By this point, we will have covered all of the basics of Vue 3 and the Composition API, and we're going to put all of that knowledge into practice by creating a real-world app called Noteballs, which is a note-taking app, which we're going to make look responsive and presentable using the Bulma CSS library. So I'll introduce you to the Noteballs app. Then we're going to create a brand new project using the latest Vue build tool, again, using Vite. We're going to install Vue Router manually, completely from scratch, and set it all up from scratch. Then in Module 14, we're going to work on the design of our app using the Bulma CSS library. We're going to install Bulma, create a beautiful navbar design, which is responsive, which shows straight up links to our 2 pages on desktop, but then shows a burger menu on mobile. And then we're going to work on the design of our notes page. In Module 15, we're going to add some data, methods, and child components to our app. We're going to set up the data and methods for adding a new note. We're going to create a child component for our note. We're going to pass data to that child component using props. We're going to set up a computed property, and we're going to add the ability to delete a note. In Module 16, we're going to install Pinia and set it all up completely from scratch. And we're also going to create a reusable component, which we're going to use on multiple pages in our app. So after we've installed Pinia, we're going to set up the state for our app, where we're going to store all of our notes data. Then we're going to set up some actions for adding, deleting, and updating a note. Then we're going to create a getter in our Pinia store for getting the content of a note based on a note's ID. Then we're going to create a second page, a stats page, which will display stats, which are based on our notes data. And we're going to set up a couple of new getters to do this. And we're also going to create a reusable component, which we're going to use on multiple pages in our app. And we're going to make this reusable component customizable using props. In Module 17, we're going to add some directives, watchers, and composables to our app Noteballs. We're going to add a directive which will allow us to auto-focus a text area. And we're going to make this directive global and use it on multiple pages. We're going to set up a watcher. We're going to create a custom composable which will allow us to share reactive data and related methods across pages. Then we're going to improve that composable by allowing it to accept multiple parameters. And we're also going to add a composable from the Vue use library, the click outside composable. And finally, in Module 18, we're going to add a delete modal to our app, which will be displayed when we try to delete a note and will prompt us to confirm. So we're going to set up the modal, get it looking presentable. We're going to allow this modal to modify data on its parent page component by using model value and update model value. We're going to reuse the click outside composable from Vue use so that we can click outside of this modal to close it. We're going to set up some keyboard control for our modal so that we can hit escape to close the modal. And in the process of doing that, we're also going to make use of some lifecycle hooks. The Composition API is the biggest new feature that came with Vue 3. But what is the Composition API? Well, it gives us a new way to create Vue components, an alternative to the Options API. Now, we can still use the Options API in Vue 3 apps, but I would consider using the Composition API exclusively, especially on more complicated apps and Vue components. The Composition API solves 2 main problems that we sometimes see with Options API apps, especially more complicated apps. Number 1, it allows us to more easily group relevant code together in the script sections of our Vue components. And number 2, it allows us to reuse our code more easily, as in our reactive data and our methods and watchers, etc. using composables. And to demonstrate this first point, let's take a look at this Options API code. So in the Options API, we have our default export, and within that we have all of our different options separated out. By options, I mean things like data, methods, and lifecycle hooks. And in this example here, we have two completely unrelated sets of data. We have a username property and a property for determining whether or not a modal is shown. And then in our methods option, we have a method for updating the username and a method for showing the modal by changing this data property. And we also have a lifecycle hook, the mounted hook, which will fire both of these methods. However, all of the relevant code is separated out. We have the username up here, the method for the username down here, and the trigger of this method in this mounted hook down here. And this means that in more complicated components, we have to do lots of scrolling up and down to data, methods, computed properties, lifecycle hooks, in order to work on code which is related. The Composition API solves this problem by allowing us to remove all of these options and allowing us to group all of our code together logically. Let's take a look at a Composition API version of this code. And in this example, we're doing exactly the same thing. We're setting up reactive data variables for our username and our isModalShown data properties. We're setting up methods for manipulating these data properties. And we're still triggering these methods in the mounted hook here and here. Except this time, all of our relevant code is grouped together. All of the code related to the username is grouped together here. And all of the code related to the modal is grouped together here. And with the Composition API, it's not just data properties, methods, and lifecycle hooks we can group together. We can group together everything, whether it's computed properties, watches, directives, etc. So this makes our lives much easier, especially when we're working on much more complicated and longer Vue components. The second problem that the Composition API solves is that it makes it much easier for us to reuse code across our components using composables. In the Options API, we could share code across components using mixins. Let's take a look at our Options API code example again. Let's say we want to reuse our username data property and our update username method across multiple components. In the Options API, we could extract this code into a mixin, such as this, where we've literally just cut the username data property and the update username method and put it into a mixin. And we can then import this mixin into a component or a bunch of different components like this, import mixin username from, etc. But in this example here, we're also importing a different mixin, which is unrelated, this mixin modal mixin. And you can see that in the mounted hook, we're firing a method from the mixin username, this update username method. The problem is that it's not obvious where this method is coming from. Is it coming from the username mixin or is it coming from the modal mixin? And if you're not familiar with the project that you're currently working on, you might not be able to tell where this method is coming from without actually opening up these mixin files and looking through the code. And again, this can become a huge problem in more complicated Vue apps where we have many different components and many different mixins being used. Let's take a look at our Composition API example again. So let's say we want to do the same thing. We want to extract the username data variable and we want to extract this update username method. Well, we can cut these out and paste them into a composable, which would look something like this. So in a composable, we just export a function, and you can see within that we have our username data variable and our update username method as well. And we can then import this composable into any Vue component we want, like this. So we just import the root level function which we exported. Then we can use destructuring to extract only the stuff that we need from that composable. In this case, we're extracting the username data variable and the update username method. And now when we use something from our composable, such as in this mounted hook, we're firing the update username method, we can see exactly where this method is coming from. So again, this becomes a massive advantage with the Composition API, especially on much more complicated apps and Vue components. So hopefully this explains the massive advantages which come with the Composition API over the Options API. Okay, let's get started now by creating a new Vue project. First of all, let's jump to the Vue docs site. So I'm just going to Google Vue 3 and jump to the Vue 3 website. And at the time I'm recording this, the Vue docs are about to be massively revamped. And I'm going to be using the new version of the docs in this course because it shows us how to build a Vue 3 project with Vite using the latest build tool. So to jump to the next version of the documentation, I'm going to jump to the address bar and just change this V3 to staging. And we now see the beautiful new documentation. And if you're already seeing this, then just stay where you are. And then we want to click on install and scroll down a bit. And before we can create a new Vue project, we need to make sure we have Node.js installed. So if you don't have that installed, then click on this link. And you probably want to install the one on the left here. And you just want to download that and install it. Or if you prefer, you can use a node versioning tool such as NVM. Let's jump back to the Vue docs page and create our first Vue 3 project with Vite with the latest build tool. So to create a new project, we can just run this command in our terminal. I'll just zoom in a bit. So npm init vue at latest. So I'm going to copy this and jump to VS Code and jump to the terminal. And again, we can toggle that with command and backtick. And I'm going to paste that command in and launch it. And by the way, you want to make sure you're in the folder where you store your projects. And we need to install this create Vue latest package. So I'll just type in Y to allow that. And it's going to ask us for some options here. For the project name, which will also be the folder name, I'm going to use Vue-composition-API-basics because we're going to be using this app to learn all of the basics of Vue 3 and the composition API. I'm going to choose no to TypeScript, no to JSX support. I'm going to choose yes to add Vue Router to our app. Later on in the course, when we create our course app, Noteballs, we're going to be choosing no to this option, and I'm actually going to show you how to install Vue Router manually from scratch. But for simplicity, while we're learning the basics, I'm going to choose yes and get the build tool to do this for us automatically. And again, for Pinia, I'm going to choose yes. Although later on in the course, I am going to show you how to add Pinia to a Vue 3 project manually. I'm going to choose no to vtest, no to Cypress, and no to ESLint. You might want to consider using ESLint in your own projects. But for simplicity, I'm going to choose no just for the purposes of this course so that you don't get loads of annoying linting errors. But if you really want to choose yes, then you can do, but I'm going to choose no. And that's finished. You can see it scaffolded our project super quickly, and it tells us how to get started. We need to cd into the folder it created, run npm install to install the dependencies, and run npm run dev to launch the app in the browser. So I'm just going to jump over to Finder, and I can see the folder it's created here. So I'm going to drag that into VS Code, open up the terminal again, and run npm install to install the dependencies. And that's finished, and we can launch the app with npm run dev. And we can see this URL here. If we command and click on that, we can now see the basic Vue 3 and Vite starter app running in the browser. Let's simplify this project as much as possible to make it easy for us to practice the basics of Vue 3 and the composition API. First of all, I just want to change the title which appears in the tab, which currently says Vite app. So I'm going to jump to index.html and change the text in this title tag to Vue composition API basics. Save that, and we see that update instantly. And I'm going to close that. And now let's simplify our pages or our views. Currently we just have two pages or views, the home view and the about view. And let's simplify the home view first. So I'm going to go to source and views and home view.view. I'm just going to stop this message appearing by choosing don't show again. And I'll just close that. And sometimes I'm going to be hiding the sidebar here. If you want to hide it, you can go to view and appearance and toggle this show sidebar, or you can use the keyboard shortcut. So I'm just going to hide that for now. And I'm going to remove this script tag. I'm going to remove everything inside the template tags and just add a div with a class of home. And inside that, I'll add a h1 heading and just put the text home in there and save that. And we can see that's updated. And then I'm going to copy this code and jump to about Vue.vue in the same folder and just paste over everything in here. And I'll change the class to about and change the text in the heading to about as well. Save that. And we now have two really simple views. Now let's get rid of all this stuff at the top. And that's in our root Vue component, which is app.vue in source app.vue. So I'm going to open that up, hide the sidebar, and I'm actually going to hide the terminal as well. We don't need to see the terminal most of the time. And all I really want in our layout is this navigation here so that we can get to our pages. And that's this nav element here with these two router link components. So I'm going to copy this nav element and both of these router links. And then I'm going to select the whole of this header and just paste those over that. Fix the indentation. We do need to make sure we leave this router view component because they allow us to display our actual views, our home view and our about view. I'll save that. And this is looking nice and simple. And I'm going to remove the script section and save that. And I'm going to remove some of these styles, but not all of them because some of them look quite pretty. But if we drag this out, we can see that beyond a certain resolution, everything gets moved around. So I'm just going to remove the styles which are doing that. So if we scroll down this style section, we can see this media query here with the min width set to 1024 pixels. And I'm just going to collapse that by clicking this little arrow next to that, and then select all of that media query and just delete that and save it. And now if we increase the width of the browser, it should just stay the same, which it is. And we don't need any of the components in the components folder now. So I'm going to jump to source and components. I'm going to select everything in this components folder by clicking on the first item, holding down shift and clicking the bottom one, and then right click and delete and get rid of those. And we see this error, but if we just reload the page, then that error disappears. And we now have a super simple app that we can use to get started learning the basics of Vue 3 and the composition API. So let's get started learning the basics. Let's create a really simple counter app using the options API and then convert it into the composition API. This will help us quickly see the differences between the two approaches. And we'll do this on our home view. So I'm going to jump to source, views, and home view.vue. And I'm just going to get rid of this heading. And we're just going to have a div with a button and a counter. So I'll add a button element with a class of btn with the text minus. Then I'll duplicate that and change the text to plus. And then in the middle, we'll add a span with a class of counter. And for now, I'll just put 0 in there and save that. Let's just add some styles to put this in the center and make it look a bit more pretty. So let's add a style block and we'll target this home div and just center everything. So .home, text align center. Save that. And I'll add a little bit of padding so our counter isn't stuck right up against the nav. So set the padding to 20 pixels and save that. Let's just increase the size of these buttons and the counter and make a little bit of space between everything. So I'm going to target the button class and the counter class and set the font size to 40 pixels. Save that. And I'll set the margin to 10 pixels. Save that. Okay, that's looking pretty decent. Let's set up some data and methods to get this app working using the options API. So we need to add our script section. And inside that, we need to add our export default. And let's set up our data first for this counter. So we need to add a data method, which returns an object. And we could put all of our data properties in here. So I'll add a property called counter. set that to 0 and save that. And we should be able to use that in our template now. So I'll get rid of this 0, add double curly braces, and we'll just put counter in here and save that. And if I change this now, we should see it update in the template, which we do. I'll set that back to 0. And now let's set up some methods for increasing and decreasing this counter. So I'm going to add a click handler to this button, this plus button. So at click equals, and we'll fire a method called increase counter. And let's create this method. So after our data method, I'll add a comma, and then we need to add our methods object, and we'll create this method increase counter. And all we want to do is increase this counter property by 1. So to access our data properties, we can just do this dot and then counter, and we can just do plus plus to increase it by 1. I'll save that and let's see if that's working. Yeah, we can increase the counter. So now we just need a method to decrease the counter. So I'll add a comma here and I'll duplicate this method, rename it to decrease counter, and just change the code to this dot counter minus minus to decrease this counter property. And then I'll copy this click handler from the plus button and add it to the minus button and just change the method name to decrease counter and save that. And we can now increase and decrease our counter. Let's switch this simple app over to using the composition API. And one important thing to note is that everything in the template stays the same. We don't need to change anything in the template. Generally with the composition API, everything in the template works exactly the same. We use data properties, computed properties, methods in exactly the same way. The only place we do things differently is in the script section. So I'm going to comment out this options API script section for now. So I'll add an opening comment at the top of it and then a closing comment at the bottom of it. Let's add a new script section where we'll use the composition API. So script. Now we can use the composition API with two different patterns. There's the setup function pattern, which was the original pattern, which came when the composition API first came out. And then we have the second pattern, which is the script setup pattern, which was released later on and is much better. But for now, let's just use the original setup function pattern, although we will later use the superior script setup pattern. So to use the setup function pattern, again, we need to add our export default. But we don't add options like data, methods, etc. Instead, we add a setup function like this, and we place all of our code in here. Basically, all of our data properties, methods, computed properties, watchers, etc. will all go inside this setup function. Let's set up a reactive data variable for our counter. Now in the composition API, there are two main types of reactive data. We have refs and reactive objects. And I'll get into these in more detail later on in the course. But basically, a reactive object allows us to create an object of data with a bunch of related data properties inside that object, whereas a ref is generally used for simple single items of data, such as a string, an array, or a number. So it makes sense to use a ref for this. So to set up a ref, we can just create a constant and give it a name. And whatever name we use will be the name that's available in the template. So we're going to call this counter, since that's the name we've used in our template here. And we want to set that equal to the ref method like this. And then we can pass our initial value inside this method. So let's set that to 0 initially. And because we're using this ref method, we need to import this method from Vue. So above our export, we need to import ref from Vue. Now this counter ref is not available in our template yet. We also need to return it when we're using the setup function pattern. So right at the bottom of our setup function, we need to add a return statement. And this return statement should always stay at the bottom of the setup function. And then we just need to return this counter ref like this and save that. And hopefully this counter should be hooked up now. We can see 0 on the page. And if we change the value of this ref and save it, we can see it's updated on the template. I'm just going to set this back to 0 and save that. Okay, we now need to add our decrease counter and increase counter methods. And the way we do this is just by creating some named functions anywhere within this setup function, and then we need to return them just like we returned this counter ref. So let's create a method for increasing the counter. So we can either do this like this with the function keyword, so function increase counter, or we can do a constant named increase counter, which we set equal to a function like this, which is the method that I usually use. And so all we want to do is increase this counter ref by 1. And you might think we'd be able to just do counter plus plus, but actually this won't work with the composition API, because when we create a ref, it actually creates an object, and the value of our ref is stored in a property called value. So to access this, we actually need to do counter.value, and we can then do plus plus. And again, in order to use this method in our template, we need to return it. So we can just add it to this return object like this, increase counter. And since we already have our click handler here, which is firing the same method, then this should work. So I'll save that, click on the plus button, and that's working. So now we just need to create the decrease counter method. So I'll duplicate this increase counter method, rename it to decrease counter, and just change the plus plus to minus minus so that it decreases the counter value by 1. And again, we need to return this. So we'll add it to our return statement down here, decrease counter, save that, and hopefully both buttons should be working. And yeah, everything is working. In Vue 3.2, a new syntax or pattern for the composition API was introduced, which is the script setup pattern or syntax. Script setup allows us to make our components a lot simpler, less cluttered, and easier to manage. It allows us to get rid of the export default, get rid of the setup function, and most importantly, get rid of the return statement. So with the script setup pattern, we no longer need to worry about making sure all of our data properties, methods, computed properties, etc. are returned. Now, on a simple component like this, it might not make much difference, but in a really complicated app with hundreds of components, which each have tons of different data properties, methods, watches, computed properties, etc., it really makes our life easier not having to constantly keep this return statement updated every time we change any of our data properties, methods, or rename them, etc. And for my own app, Fudget 2, which I'm currently working on, I actually spent a whole day converting around 100 components from this setup function pattern to the new script setup pattern. And that was a really boring day, but it was well worth it because now the app is much easier to work on. And by the way, the script setup pattern is the pattern I'm going to be using for the rest of the course because it's much simpler and it's the pattern that the Vue team recommends. So let's convert this code to the new script setup pattern. So I'm going to comment out this script section and we'll add a new script section here. Now we don't need to add our export default and we don't need to add this setup function. All we need to do is add a setup attribute to this opening script tag like this. And we can now place all of our code in here, all of our data properties, methods, etc. And we don't even need to return any of these. So let's just copy our two methods and our counter ref from the old code and paste it straight in here and just fix the indentation. And we still need to import this ref method from Vue, so I'll copy that. We just place all of our imports at the top of this script section like this. And now we don't need to return our data ref or our methods. Any data properties or methods or computed properties that we declare at the top level of this script tag will be available in our template automatically. So if I save this now, it should just be working straight away. And yeah, it's still working. And we've now reduced our script section from, let's see, 21 lines down to just 11 lines. So we've massively simplified our code and we no longer need to worry about this pesky return statement. If you want to grab the full course, jump over to dannys.link/composition-API and the link is in the description. Or there are 7 more videos to go in this series on YouTube. Make sure you click subscribe and click the bell if you don't want to miss any of them. And you can find a link to the whole playlist down in the description.